Okay, Galatians. As you guys have been discussing, like I said, I have not been here even since you started the book. Tim covered the introduction and most of the first chapter. And you guys already noticed that the similarities between the book of Galatians and the Corinthian letter. And especially the latter part, of 2 Corinthians, the last few chapters. And what were those similarities? Because that's going to really, we're not going on a tangent. It really ties into chapter 2 and what you've been discussing in chapter 1. What's the similarities between 2 Corinthians and Galatians? Nancy?
They were trying to say that Paul, that there was false teachers in both of them, and that they were teaching a gospel different from what Paul brought to them.
That's right. And if somebody teaches differently than what you're teaching, what are they basically saying about you? Right. In other words, so if they're teaching something different than Paul, then Paul is basically saying, well, then you're questioning who I am. You're questioning my apostleship. And so in Galatians, the first chapter, you guys have been dealing with that whole aspect, and Paul having to defend himself, especially comparing himself with the other apostles. You were discussing last week, and it was just the last few verses you were about to get into, where he mentions in verse 22 of Galatians chapter 1, he says, "And I was unknown by face to the churches of Judea, which were in Christ. But they were hearing only, he who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith which he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God in me." So again, Paul is just basically telling them about his past. He's going to get into that in this second chapter, which I'm anxious to get into, because you can see how Paul is having again to defend himself. Are you really an apostle? You can just hear it. Is Paul really an apostle? And so he's going to be talking about the fact that his calling was from the Lord, and his teachings, as I'm telling you about chapter 2, his teachings were not dependent upon man. Matter of fact, it wasn't even the other apostles. It wasn't like the apostles trained me, the other apostles trained me. I got it from the Lord. And it was a long time before I even spent time with those apostles. And so this is going to be a great thing for us to examine. I'm just going to put it here. We're going to cover 1 through 10, where Paul's still defending his apostleship. And then we're going to get into 11 through 21. Again, believe it or not, we could have come down here in this part and said, Paul is still defending his apostleship. Well, how would he be defending his apostleship? By confronting Peter. Well, we're going to talk about that, which is very important, all right? And so you're going to see this. And so without rehashing what you did in chapter 1, let's just go ahead and get into chapter 2. We're going to read the first 10 verses, 2 verses apiece. Let's start, let's take advantage of some folks on this side, because we got Andrew and Charlotte visiting with us too. But Keith, we'll start with you since you're at the very back. Let's take 2 verses apiece, and that'll get us up to the next row you all have. All right. And listen carefully, folks, the way these 10 verses of how Paul is defending his apostleship.
Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and also took Titus with me. And I went up by revelation and communicated to them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or pass out in vain.
Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And this occurred because the false brethren, secretly brought in, who came in by stealth to spy out other Greeks, by which we have in Jesus Christ, that they might bring us into bondage.
But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. But from those who were of high reputation, what makes no difference to me, God shows no partiality, while those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me.
But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised, effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles.
And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles, and they to be circumcised. They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was also eager to do.
All right. I'll tell you guys, if you go back to Acts chapter 15, you're going to remember in the 15th chapter, and that's when Paul had to deal with those who had come up to Jerusalem, or actually had brought down this concept from Jerusalem, and that's why Paul went back to Jerusalem. It's all in that time frame where Paul had to confront those people who were saying that, well, the Gentiles had to be circumcised in order to be saved. Paul had to deal with this. And so he's going back and recounting what has already transpired in order to let these folks understand what the truth of the matter is. And what was the controversy anyway? Yeah, I know they're questioning his apostleship, but what was the controversy?
That they had to be circumcised.
It was all about going back under the old law that the uncircumcised, which is who? Gentiles, right? And the circumcised, the Jews. Okay, trying to get the Gentiles to be like the Jews. And again, going back under that old law, that problem, this is the book. This is why I'm excited about this book. Kind of like I was excited about Corinthians and every other study that we do in the Bible. But it really helps us to see what's going on in that time period of what the early church had to face. Church faces problems today, right? Do we have problems with false teaching? Do people want to bring things in subtle ways and bind things on people, bind their opinions on other people? It's the same thing. This is why it is useful for us to study and knowing what Paul was up against. And so people are questioning his apostleship. And if we're preaching the truth and false teachers come in, what are they going to accuse us of? They're not going to accuse me of being a false apostle, but what would they accuse me of? Being a false teacher. All right? And so how would I defend myself? Go back to the word, right? Exactly. And so what Paul has to do in defending his apostleship is just tell the what? Tell the truth. And so I'm just going to recount what's been going on. You guys are going to see this. And look what he does here. We're in chapter 2. As you guys just read 1 through 10, let's look at it. He says, then. Now, then, he's continuing the thought. Man puts the verses in the chapters in here. Remember, the thought is continuing on here as he writes to the Galatian brethren. They glorified God in me. They understood these things, that I was changed. I used to persecute the church, all right? Then he obeyed the gospel, which, by the way, where's that in the Bible? Acts 9. Okay, that's good. All right, Acts chapter 9. So here he is, Saul, and then we're actually covering that on the radio program today, not now. So then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem. Now, I hope you caught that word again, right? All right, so he had been there. But it's almost like Paul saying that, when I went up this time, it was like then I had talked with the other apostles. It almost is implying that he had been up there before, but he didn't spend a lot of time, or he didn't have opportunity to talk with the other apostles. But he says after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and also took Titus with me. And then went up by revelation. Remember, that's when the Lord said, depart, go. He went up by revelation and communicated to them the gospel which I preached among the Gentiles. But privately to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. Who might those be? And in Jerusalem, it was the hub, right? I mean, who stayed in Jerusalem, Trevor? And the other apostles. They stayed in Jerusalem. Okay? And so here it is. Paul comes up. Barnabas comes up. He talks with them. Even talks with them privately. There's some wisdom in this. I mean, if you're going to try to take care of the problems and the misunderstandings that are there, you want to get together and talk with the leaders of the church that was there. And primarily we're talking about the apostles. Why would you do that? What is he wanting to make sure of? The same thing. Let's just make sure we're on the same page. I like that. That's what you want, right? I mean, you want to be in agreement. And so he's telling the Galatian brethren, remember this epistle, this letter that was written to them, he's telling them what transpired. Because if you're going to discredit Paul's apostleship, ultimately what Paul wants them to understand is, if you're going to discredit me, what should that lead them to? All the apostles. I love the logic here. I love what he's doing. That's what you do when you're studying with people, right? You're trying to get them to be consistent or show their inconsistency. And you try to show them, okay, so if you're telling me that all I have to do is believe and be saved, let's go to James chapter 2, and even the demons believe and tremble. So are you trying to tell me that they're saved? You see, you want them to see that inconsistency or where it leads them. And I love what Paul's doing here. It teaches us, how many times I've told you guys, as we study the word, it teaches us how to teach. And so he's doing that here. And so I talk with them because lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. And we know what vain means, right, guys? What's that? Useless, waste. Paul doesn't want to do that. And so, yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Why bring that up? Mark?
Case in point, here in this chapter, later on when he confronts Peter, here's my evidence. Here's Titus. It's not like Timothy, who was father and mother, was Jew and Gentile, and he was able to get circumcised, bring somebody out of the Gentile world.
And uses an example of somebody here, he did. Nancy?
Kind of like with the teaching, it's like the teaching of the gospel didn't say anything about being circumcised.
No.
So he wasn't compelled because it wasn't a requirement.
It wasn't a requirement. And that's what he's trying to get across to these folks. And without jumping ahead, I hope you guys are understanding that when we get to this next section, when Paul confronts Peter, remember, Peter was eating with the Gentiles. And then when he saw Jews come, he wanted to separate himself. Okay. And so you need to say to yourself that, well, first of all, why was Peter eating with the Gentiles in the first place? So you need to understand that they know. They understood this. Okay, Peter playing the hypocrite is one thing. It's not like Peter's like going, well, that's just wrong. I thought it was wrong to eat with the Gentiles. No, you didn't think it was wrong to eat with Gentiles because you were eating with the Gentiles. Okay? So you need to understand that he understood. And when did Peter understand this? When did Peter understand that it's okay to eat with the Gentiles, associate with them? Well, guys, you know this.
When he went to,
He yelled at him. Cornelius. Where's that? Acts 10, right? Acts 10, and then talks about it in chapter 11, okay? And so here he was. Now, did Peter want to go to Cornelius? No, he had to see that vision, right? Don't call these things that are unclean. And so Peter was hesitant of going, and of course he took Jews with him to see Cornelius and his household. And then when Cornelius and his household wanted to be baptized, that's where Peter turns to the Jews and says, well, who can forbid water that these might be baptized? They received the Holy Spirit just as we did, like in Acts chapter 2. So Peter had already learned this. And so bringing up these stories, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I wanted you to see how it all ties in to Paul defending his apostleship, who he is, and trying to help them understand circumcision. Bringing something from the old law. Oh, surely that doesn't happen today. Surely people don't bring things from the old law and bind it on people today. For those people who are watching streaming this, that is called sarcasm. Okay, what things do people bind it? Oh, huge. I tell you what, of all the years we've been doing radio, of all the years we've been doing live radio, what got that phone ringing off the receiver so many times or off the hook? Thank you. You just don't say that anymore, you know. I've seen a cartoon recently where somebody's kid's telling his grandmother, what do you mean hang up? Or, hang it up or whatever. Old time expressions that are there. Tithing. Let the phone up. Why? Why not let the phone up? Of all subjects, we've discussed everything under the sun. Why is tithing? It's like, that's absurd. It's there. You can read it. It's plain as day, right? Is circumcision plain as day? Absolutely. Trey?
And what's so funny about that is that the majority of them that are going on and on about tithing are giving 10%.
Yeah. They're not even practicing the biblical application. I don't really want to go on a tangent here, but that's a good point. But again, it's this idea of saying, well, And you have to understand, folks, you really have to understand that the reason why we have trouble communicating the tithing issue with people today is the reason why Paul is having a hard time with the subject of circumcision. We're talking about generations and generations and generations. This is the way we've always done it. This was a sign of showing that we are God's special people. And then you have groups today that they say we've always done it this way. And you've heard me preach on this before. Could they say they've always done it that way? No. Any tradition of man had a beginning. Every tradition of man has a beginning. So you can't say we've always done it that way. But again, we see that similar problem. I thought I saw him. Did I see him? Was just tithing the things that people bring over? Oh, Mallory, your hand was up. What do you remember? What did you like?
Never mind. I thought it through.
You thought it through?
My own question.
You answered your own question. Man, I like that. When I see hands, I should just keep rambling. And people go, no, you just answer. Nancy?
I was going to say, so ask the question.
That's the point. Yeah, that's why we ask questions. And sometimes we ask questions we already know the answer to help others. Okay, so you see what Paul's doing here. People bring things over. We have it happen today. Instrumental music, okay, the wearing of special garments. The list goes on and on. They originate from the Old Testament. People say, well, I have biblical authority for it. And this idea of circumcision was pretty powerful in their minds, okay, remember that, because it was something that was even practiced before the old law, circumcision. And then they practiced it when the old law was established, the law of Moses. And so in their minds, man, it's been there, okay?
All the old law that was for the Jews was nailed to the cross.
Right, and that's what he's trying to get across here, David, which they understood in obedience to the gospel that he's going to be talking about. Look what he has in verse 4. And this occurred because of false brethren secretly brought in, who came in by stealth to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage. The whole point of the gospel was to bring what? Yeah, liberty, which means what? Freedom. Gives us freedom. And you're going to see this when we get into one of my favorite passages to teach people when they really struggle with this, is in Galatians chapter 5. When we get to the first 4 verses there, he talks about the idea that you're supposed to be free in Christ, but if you go back to that old law, bring some of those things over again, you've gone right back into bondage. Who wants to be free from prison today and then go right back in? I mean, who wants to do that? I know they do that, but who wants to go right back in? It's ridiculous. And Paul is trying to tell them, no. That these false teachers are trying to bring us into bondage. Verse 5, to whom we did not yield submission for even an hour. And I like this. Somebody brings in some false teaching here, I just ignore it. I go away. Let's not make an issue. Good practice? Why? Yeah, right.
Not on that, but above that. When Titus wasn't compelled to be circumcised, the leaders that he met privately with, they didn't ask that Titus be circumcised, right?
Right.
These other little.
That's the point.
Okay.
They knew it.
Okay.
And that's why he makes reference back to Acts chapter 15 when they said, well, they just sent us on our way and basically said everything's okay, but take up a collection for the needy saints, which is kind of a cool thing too, because you're taking up a collection from where? Gentiles. You're going to help the needy saints who are Jews. Charlotte.
Well, if you know that there's false teaching going on and you ignore it or choose not to act on that, then you are condoning it.
That's the point. Not only is the little leaven leavens the whole lump that he had to deal with in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, you nip it, you get on it right away, because it can permeate. But silence, as we've often said, is consent. Speak up. I like what Paul does here, because Paul's just saying, you know what, right away, immediately, we were all over this. You go back to Acts 15, it's a great study, by the way. And we went through the book of Acts, but it's just really great. So he says, to whom we did not even yield submission for even an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But from those who seem to be something, Whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man. For those who seem to be something, added nothing to me. Oh man, I like that. Who's he talking about? It sure sounds to be like the apostles. Sure sounds like, those people who seem to be something, you know what? They didn't add a thing. I kind of like that. It's not like he's putting down the other apostles, but what's he kind of saying here, guys? What's he doing? He's not putting down leaders, but Mark?
Even though he's came years later, he's still needed.
They're not here and I'm here. Basically saying, you're not telling me anything I don't know. But that's not an insult. You could come here and hear a sermon. You could walk away and say, Chuck this morning preached a sermon. Didn't tell me anything I didn't know. Okay, you didn't insult me. You're just saying you've read it before, you've studied it before. That's a good thing, right?
Well, I didn't think he was talking about the apostles. I'd like to talk about those leaders. Because he says, pridefully to those who are of reputation, and then those who seem to be something.
Now, those of reputation, again, you have the leaders within the congregation. You could have elders, okay? You could have the apostles that were there. But whoever they were, Paul is saying, none of them influenced me. Is the point. Or they didn't add to it. They didn't come back and say, now, Paul, you should also say that I've already had the information. That's the point. When you have the gospel, and he was inspired, Paul was inspired. Were the apostles inspired?
Yeah.
They were inspired. I mean, couldn't they have imparted something to him? Well, but they were not going to impart it. Well, if you're inspired and you're inspired, what advantage does one have over the other? Nothing. That's the point. That's the point. They didn't add anything. It's not like I didn't respect those people of influence. Okay, those of reputation. There's respect there. But he's trying to defend himself. Remember, he's still defending his apostleship. So it's not like they took me aside and straightened me out on something and clarified something for me. No, there was none of that going on. And so, because of that, and of course he points out that God shows personal favoritism to no man. For those who seem to be something, added nothing to me. But on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcision had been committed to me, as the gospel of the circumcision was to Peter, and he continues on. I want to take a breath there because there's no period. He's basically now going to be talking about the fact that what did Paul and Peter have in common? We read it in this section. He didn't come out and say it, but what did they have in common? What was he saying? Yeah, but in the sense that they're both called to be apostles. What was different among them? What was Paul trying to say? Was there any difference? What was he saying when he preached? Preached to the Gentiles, and Peter who preached to who? The Jews. That there was absolutely no difference amongst them. When he preached to the Jews, he exercised inspiration. The spiritual gifts were passed on. He demonstrated it. Remember, if you're going to confirm the word with signs and wonders, there was absolutely no, you have to picture this. You got to know your audience. These are people that are struggling with wanting to go back under the old law and bring it back and bind circumcision on the Gentiles. And Paul illustrates by saying, here's Peter who went to the Jews. I go to the Gentiles. What he did with the Jews, I did with the Gentiles. I'm just telling you. We did the same thing. There was no difference among us. How come? Because we're both apostles. We both had the gospel. We preached the same message. That's the way it's supposed to be.
To a certain extent, wouldn't that have to always be comparing what we're taught versus what somebody else taught? Because without this written that we can go back to, they're having somebody preach to them, and it's like, well, what did he say? Well, somebody's got to be writing this stuff down.
I like it. I like that. And it also tells me, Tim, that we're creating a pattern. There's a pattern here. If you're going to bring up what Peter does, and you're going to bring up what Paul does, and there's no difference amongst them, you're talking about a pattern. And so basically, that's why you and I, you ever attend another church, guys? You ever attend? Comfortable there? No. Yeah, you've attended faithful churches.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you've attended other faithful churches, right? Why were you comfortable there?
They follow patterns.
It's the same. It's the same. There was a pattern that is there. And people say, well, how can you be comfortable over here and you're comfortable? That's what Paul's making the point here. And the reason why we're uncomfortable in situations is when somebody's not following the pattern. Gene?
Earlier you mentioned that being called, you're teaching apostasy or whatnot, of the world that we're living in. They're not going to say that because they don't know what the word is to say you can do. You're doing that.
Yeah, it's easy to say that. Proving it's another thing, right?
They can't prove it because they're not following the word.
That's it.
So that's word today. Go to the church of your choice. We're all going to heaven. Well, maybe we teach this a little bit in this congregation or in this denomination, a little bit different, but we're all going to heaven.
If anything, I would like for Paul's teachers to learn. Of course, Paul's teachers don't want to learn anything, but I would like for them to learn that, when you make an accusation, listen to the defense. Were they making a defense the way you're making the accusation? No, because you're making an accusation without a defense to that accusation. You accuse Paul, and Paul is defending himself. There's the difference. If somebody's going to accuse me of something, and I have been in Bible studies, and I know you have too. You've ever been in a Bible study where you say, well, let me answer that, and they won't let you answer?
Right.
I've been in that situation.
They just send if you go to another congregation.
Pardon me?
They just send if you to leave and go to
Yeah,
another
exactly,
congregation.
pretty much. But they don't want to defend it, and they don't want to think logically. And what we learn from Paul here is when he's going to he honestly wants to help those people who are looking for the truth. You can't change the minds. We talked about that in our Corinthians study. You are not going to change the mind of anybody who's not looking for the truth. If they don't want the truth, guys, you can be the best Jesus, master teacher. Had people turn his back on. Paul is hoping that these Galatian brethren are going to think about what he's saying. It's inspired, of course, but it makes perfect sense. Look what I did. And you should be able to see through the problems here with the false teachers, and you should be able to see what Paul and Peter and the other apostles all have in common so that you accept what I am teaching is the truth. And if you're going to reject it, Paul's basically, we could say at the end of this, like a trial, what do you got to say about that? Really, I'd like to be with the brethren at the end of this and say, well, what do you say about that? I mean, how do you respond to that? Paul's doing the same thing as Peter. So so on the contrary, he mentions in verse 7, I read that verse a moment ago. Look at verse 8. For he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me towards the Gentiles. Who's the he? Who's the he in verse 8? For he who worked effectively in Peter. Who worked effectively in Peter? The Lord did. Holy Spirit. Peter just didn't do this on his own. Really want to get to my chart that I have next, but I just don't think I'm going to get there. Because I was going to ask you the question, but I'm going to hold off on that. You give you time to think about it. My question is, what are we learning about apostles? But I really want to finish up this part because I have a chart of a number of things that I listed there, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, and I know you guys are going to come up with a lot more that you learn about apostles. And one of the things that we're learning here when he talked about for he who worked effectively in Peter worked effectively in me, basically saying that without that we don't have any advantage. We did it with him, is the point. So Paul is not taking credit. Again, with his defending himself, there's no arrogance, it's humility. That's what he did with the Galatian folks. So I didn't want to brag on myself, but if you're going to force my hand to brag, look what I did. If they're going to brag on themselves, I don't want to. They were forcing his hand. You see Paul's humility in all this. But I'll tell you what, you can be a humble person too and still defend yourself. Person attacks you, attacks your character, attacks you for your beliefs. Stand up. You don't have to get ugly about it. But you can be like Paul here and just point them if you're wanting to change their minds. Okay. Verse 9, and when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I was eager to do. So, down the Galatian brethren, went up there, talked with them. They didn't add anything to what I had to say. I'm on par with Peter and the other apostles. And when all was said and done, what did they extend to me? The right hand of fellowship. What's that? We talk about that all the time. What's the right hand of fellowship, Mark?
Kind of like a stamp of approval. Give you my right hand, I accept you. What you're saying and doing is in line with what we're doing.
Can you extend a right hand of fellowship to somebody you know is not in fellowship with God? 1 John chapter 1. We have fellowship with one another, because we're, when you're in fellowship with God, then we have fellowship with one another. Now, it's possible that I'm extending fellowship to you, and I don't know that you're not in fellowship with God. I hope you are. Sometimes it can be fooled. But we're talking about here when you know. When you know. And you can't do that. And so Paul talking with them and telling them about all of this and what Paul believed had mentioned there. He says, I went up and I spoke on this and I told them and I didn't hold back anything. And you know what they did? They extended the right hand of fellowship. They were in total agreement with what I was doing, what I was teaching. Did Paul need that? Did he need the other apostles' approval? Didn't need it. But in a sense, he wanted it. Why? Because he really wants to help people, right? He wants to help people. If I'm studying with one of you and you go, Chuck, brother so-and-so, who's a faithful gospel preacher somewhere else, he teaches this, well, should I have to spend all the time talking about, well, we believe the same thing. He teaches the same thing. We're over here. Well, I don't know. Well, I'll call him up. Do I have to do that? I don't necessarily have to do that, but it would help them. I could do that. I mean, there's the liberties that we have. And so Paul has already proven to the fact that I don't have to rely on them, but I want you to understand that we are in agreement, and I'm not the least of the apostles. Go ahead.
Well, this is the same thing in like-minded.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, to me, it's easier for me to get they say like-minded because fellowship sometimes gets mixed up with another concept.
Yes. With Webster's definition of fellowship.
Yes. Things like that, but I'm saying for us to understand being like-minded to me works.
I like that. I like that. Fellowship is, in the biblical sense, was always on a spiritual level. And the spiritual level that we have is that like-mindedness there that we have in common. Trey.
It just kind of confuses me because if they're all apostles and they're all inspired, why weren't they inspired to know that what Paul was saying was true? I mean, they had all that inspiration from God, so why didn't they just accept Paul because God told them so?
Well, Paul is now, who are you talking about? Are you talking about those in Galatia or are you talking about those in Jerusalem? Because those in Jerusalem didn't have a problem, as far as the other apostles. They didn't have a problem with him. It was the false teachers that were having the problem with him. And Paul is, we got three groups here, right? Apostles, the Galatian brethren, right? And you also have the false teachers. Okay. And so, who's this? Oh yeah, you missed your cue. It's the letter G. And then Paul, okay? And it's important, Trey, that you see what's happening here because although Paul is dealing with the Galatian brethren, he introduced these people to expose those, okay? And so these didn't have a problem with him. They were having a problem with him because of them.
Yeah, but they were the ones that extended the fellowship, James, Peter, and John.
To what?
To Paul and Barnabas.
Yes.
But he should have because they're all...
Well, they should have. But he's telling them that. He's telling them
Oh,
that,
they extended.
that they did.
Okay.
Okay, you understand?
Okay, got
The deal, all these, this can get a little
it. I'm
confusing.
sorry.
All right. No, this is good, Trey. You're good. But this chart, as weird as it is, I like it. Because this chart is telling us that sometimes when we preach, gotta be careful about this. When we preach, some preachers might be just focusing on this. Hey, we don't have a house full of false teachers here. Okay, you might want to just preach to the brethren and talk about the truth and not just get so fired up like they're in the audience. They're not in the audience, okay? And so Paul is trying to, you can see where Paul's tone would be different if he just focused on them. But no, his goal is, no, I'm going to try to convince these guys. These guys, most of the time, religious leaders, are you going to change their minds? Most of the time, you're not, okay? I'll sit down and talk with them. But Paul's smart here, because what he's doing is helping these brethren by talking about his dealings with them to show that these guys are off base. Don't listen to them. All right? And that's what he does. That's what this chapter does in this, and as you discussed last week with Tim, and their approval of this. Everything is great. I only got 7 minutes, but this section, man, I really wanted to get in and sink my teeth into this. Make me hold off for 7 minutes. You got a comment about this? Something that we didn't discuss? Trey, you got a question?
Well, I guess that was the point I was making earlier. Let's say Paul goes to Galatians. He preaches to, he's inspired. And he tells them, preach the gospel, tells them 10 basic points, right? So those people, I can't remember all this, right? You got to write it down. Right? He told us 10 things. So false teachers come in there, they teach 12, or they teach 8, and you leave something out, or they're not going to just come in necessarily just be so off base. It's got to be look close to the. Otherwise, why would they be pulled away, right?
Right.
So what I'm saying is that they don't have the benefit of all this, right? So when a false teacher comes in, it could sound really close because what I'm comparing to is what he said, and now I wrote that down. Let me go back to what he said. You know what? Am I making sense?
You're making sense because I listened to you. You and Trey brought this up last week, and I was like going, "Oh, I want to be there." But it was a pass. But when Paul said in the first chapter, "I marvel that you are turning away so soon," what is he acknowledging? When somebody gets mad at you, why did you do that? What are they acknowledging? That it shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened. Okay? So when Paul says, I marvel that you, well, wait a minute, Paul, we don't have the word written down like others. Whoa. No. We have, the apostle was there. We have laying on the apostle's hand. We have spiritual knowledge that is there. You have there's no excuse, just like them, there's no excuse for us today drifting off. I don't care what it is.
Paul's trying to clear up some confusion from the Galatians in that first chapter. Where he said, this could be what he's referring to, another gospel.
Yes, there's no question.
We're talking about here now.
Yeah.
Peter,
You can preach, and that's why he gets to the 5th chapter, guys, because I like what Tim was talking about there. You can preach all of the same things and then slip in circumcision, right? Just slip that in there. I'm not saying don't believe in Jesus. I'm not saying don't get baptized for remission of your sins. I'm not saying don't believe this. But you got to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. And that's why he gets to the 5th chapter. He says, well, if you preach that, then you have fallen away. You have separated yourself from Christ. And so that's the danger of false teaching. You can't accept one, a little bit of liberalism. I'm comfortable with a little bit. What? No. You can't be comfortable with anything that's wrong, ever. Okay? And getting back to what you guys were discussing last week, is that they had, and even though they didn't have it written down like this, they had the letter. Let's understand, they had what we have. The letter was there, but prior to this letter being written to them, what did they have? They had the apostle preaching to them. They had inspired people. They had the Holy Spirit laid on them, and so you had people with spiritual knowledge that was there, and they could rely on that. But what often happens is that people will push that aside and reject that because the false teachers can be domineering. You remember, congregations are made up of all kinds of personalities. This one is. And some might be more timid than others. Being timid is no excuse for accepting it. Remember that, ever. No matter who you are or how long you've been a Christian. 3 more minutes. Another question. Because I really, well, Lori.
Not a question, but back to what Trey was kind of asking about, just because they're inspired, why do they have to explain,
Right.
Oh,
right.
Even though they're inspired, doesn't mean they weren't capable of mistakes. And they had to use judgment with the inspiration. And Peter, on one hand, was in error, even though he was inspired, because he was with one set of people, he was Jews, with another set of people, he was Gentiles. And he was, Paul had to confront him on that. And when Paul first became a Christian, he had spent years going against the truth. So their gut was telling them not to accept him. So in the beginning, when he first was in Jerusalem, it took a little doing to get, Barnabas had to help to prove that he had changed his ways.
I think it all tells us, as far as inspiration is concerned, it has limitations. And it's not going to make you act a certain way, which we will see when we get into the next section in this chapter. Just being an apostle doesn't make you immune to sin. Let's put it that way too, which we're going to get into. And I do want you to be thinking about this, because next week I do have that chart, and I'll probably be thinking more to add to that. Maybe we'll have a couple of charts on that one, but I'd be interested. I want you of what we've read so far. Not only will we get a lot from the next section, but I want you to list what are some things that we just know about apostles. What do we know about them? And an obvious one that we've already been mentioning is that they're just men. They're ordinary men. Let's get that, all right? And it's a great lesson for us today, because sometimes people look at preachers as who? Yeah, not ordinary men. What? Oh yeah, you're above. You're above temptation. You're above this. You're above that. And that's what gets congregations in trouble, by the way. And that's a problem that Peter had to learn.
We have to be careful how we, if we're talking to someone or about the word or whatnot, we have to be careful about our activities with them. Like Peter had a little problem here with the circumcision thing. That was trouble.
Well, and that was his hypocrisy. That's the point. You don't want to be inconsistent with your faith. That's all. We have liberties. We understand that. But Peter knew, and that was the point. You're going to see that next week again. Peter knew what he was doing was okay when he was eating. He knew that, 100%.
In other words, if I saw you coming out of the boat downtown, red and black boy, wait a minute.
Yeah.
What minute? Now you said, well, Gene, I went down there and this guy's talking to him, and he had a Pepsi Cola. I had a Pepsi Cola, and then you have to be careful who you're seen with.
Well, yeah, anything. Yeah, your example. That's true. In this case, these guys. Okay, and I'm not going to give these guys credit. People are going to accuse you of false things all the time. It's like, you know what? I'm not. You can't stop people from telling lies. And like I said before, you can't stop people from believing lies. Thanks, guys. I appreciate that. And come next week, we're going to go. Yeah, it's really good stuff.
Yeah.